me to the recording. Okay, welcome, Robyn. Thanks so much for agreeing to this exploration. I think it's going to be very, very rich and interesting for everybody to participate and co-discover. And the first question, because some of the people in the room know you better than others, but so make sure everyone's on the same page. Could you give us a little bit of your backstory of how you came to be interested in educational systems change?
Fantastic. Thank you, Dave. So thank you firstly for your extraordinarily kind introduction and for having me here with you. It's a real honor. I feel very honored. Thank you. And yeah, just a little sort of backstory. So I sort of typically describe myself as a little bit of a mongrel because I have an eclectic background. And a sort of brief overview, I started out life in medical practice. I was in practice for 17 years in an amazing family medicine practice, dealt with lots of family systems. It was really interesting. I dealt with quite a lot of HIV work and yeah, a lot of psychology, a lot of psychiatry, and a lot of children. So I do adore children, and I actually really do rather like human beings. And at the same time, simultaneously, I was very involved in my children's school. So I sat on the governing body foundation, which is like a board, sort of a board of parents and community members of my boys' school. And I was there for about a decade, which gave me extraordinary insight into South Africa's government sector schooling system, albeit at a quite high functioning level. And in that role, I was feeling a little bit restless in my practice, but in that role, I was invited to read the National Development Plan chapter on HIV and TB for South Africa's, as we were kind of finalizing South Africa's National Development Plan, which is the most exquisite document. And when I read that document, it was like landing back in my somewhat idealistic 17 or 18-year-old self and feeling like, you know what, this is what I'm interested in. And because I'm now 40, which I was at the time, I can afford to say that I'm not being idealistic, I'm being visionary. And actually make a choice around, well, that's what I want to do. And so the draft chapter really is about active citizenship. So it's about specifically around this chapter was specifically around creating incredible social networks around schools and mobilizing all of the resources around schools for the well-being of the full community, not just the learners in the school, but actually for the full community. So schools almost as nidus points for community, where churches might have been there previously. I think the school has increasingly taken that role. And so I wrote myself a business plan. I went to see a few people. They all laughed at me. And within a week or two, I came across an organization that had almost a carbon copy of its vision. And so I joined that organization. I wound up working for them for 4.5 years. Incredible, incredible learning curve. I often say it's like stepping out of this 2x4 room into a huge house that you kind of just discover lots and lots of different rooms and different spaces in. I did stakeholder engagement work for them. That gave me huge exposure to a lot of different segments of society. So a lot of engagement with business, lots of engagement with a huge amount of engagement with civil society, some engagement with government, some engagement with philanthropy, quite eclectic. And about 2.5 years into that role, what I started to feel was that really what I was seeing was this amazing amount of phenomenal work happening. South Africa has one of the most vibrant civil society sectors. It's full. There are incredible people doing incredible work all over the place. Businesses are very engaged in matters of society, and partly because they are mandated to be so, but actually often because they really, really are invested in that. But what started to really, what can I say, pain me, or what I really started to notice is that there was this, like lots of wheels spinning, doing amazing things, and a tremendous difficulty with being able to shift those into functioning engagement with each other. And that became more and more interesting for me. And so increasingly, I started to become interested, not in should we collaborate, because that's a, you know, intellectually, oh, absolutely, we must collaborate, but actually how? Because these are very good people doing very good work. Increasingly, I was being exposed to more, you know, also people across the African continent and having the same experience. And so I really made a decision about 2.5 years ago that this was what I wanted to explore most. How do we work together well? So the term might be collaboration, but that's a little bit of a swear word at the moment because it's husked. So it's been husked out. It's become quite politically correct. And quite frankly, the spectrum of meaning for collaboration is so vast that if you use a single word, you wind up, as Katja was saying earlier on, you know, if you're interested in co-creative work and you use the word collaboration and you find someone who's actually just interested in getting a project manager for their idea, it's really hard to bring those two things to synthesize those two things. And so, yeah, that's how I came to this place. I've been working in the field of really seeking at a very practical level to understand how do we do this? What are the conditions that help us to work together? What are the conditions that help us to humanize the way that we work together? What might happen if we pay attention to the conditions instead of the projects? And it's been an incredible journey. Lots of learnings again, like stepping out of the front door of that house into the garden. And yeah, very exciting space to be, and a very nascent space to be. Very topical at the moment.
I'm going to just, this is a wonderful encapsulation, and in fact you've sort of arrived in the middle of the dialogue in a way. The richness of that was beautiful. I'm wondering if I could just take a step back for people less familiar with South Africa, because you talked about this very visionary plan, and then you talked about like schools as hubs and lots of innovation. Could you give people a little bit more kind of idea of the strata of society and how education sits and the kinds of people that are coming into that system? Because I think we will kind of think in you know, Western European terms of primary, basic, high school education, and I'm sure you've got that there, but also I imagine there's quite a lot of difference in South Africa, and it might be good to just for people to get a fuller background to where you're sitting there, just to describe that a little.
Fantastic, absolutely. Yeah, so South Africa is a wonderful, complex, difficult, damaged, hurt, vibrant, amazing country with a lot of systemic issues that it is processing, that are being created as we speak. And you know, I think many people are familiar with the South African story. So we obviously have a history of tremendous division, of tremendous oppression, of intentional lessening or causing large segments of our society to be less undereducated, less visible, less cared for. And that has persisted in our education system. So South Africa's education system, although there's been a lot of amazing work done since 1994, which is when kind of our independence was obtained from the apartheid system, or we overcame that and we moved into a more democratic space. Our education system is still foundationally bedrocked on those principles. And so although we've made some huge progress, so basic universal education has been achieved, there might be some debate about that, but inherently it's been achieved. Unfortunately, the quality of education is massively variable, and that is because the schooling system is still fundamentally geographically located and demographically located. And so we have a system which is divided into 5 quintiles of schools, and each quintile has as its basis the general socioeconomic environment surrounding that school will determine the quintile of the school. So quintiles 1 through 3 are generally based in very impoverished communities, historically very underserved, historically Black, colored, Indian, non-white communities. And they, from an infrastructural perspective, from a personnel perspective, have a huge backlog that needs to be addressed. And typically they are non-fee paying schools. So the learners who go to those schools, because they come from very difficult socioeconomic backgrounds, will not pay school fees. And there's a whole plethora of sort of other socially related issues that go alongside that. Quintile 4 and 5 schools are typically better resourced schools, or there is possibility of movement. So if a school performs well and the demographics change slightly, the quintiles can be changed, but it's not happening at a rate of knots. And typically your quintile 5 schools are generally pretty privileged, great resources, good infrastructure, good teaching, good history, very involved parent bodies, etc. Quintile 4 is sort of also not too bad, but then the sort of vast divide. And what that means is that we just have a huge population of children that are still grappling with fundamentals of education.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that gives us that kind of more, you know, crystal background, or the detail of the background. And and you were talking about collaboration not as a thing to do. So what about those circumstances that, because you've described like 5 kind of streams, as it were, that all with very differing needs, some very extreme and others are just more, you know, probably nuanced or sophisticated at the other end. So how are you attempting to collaborate then across such are you working across all 5 levels, and how are you attempting to join them up in whatever way you are? It'd be interesting to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, so Dave, currently, so Muketsi, for instance, and Julie is not here, but there are phenomenal institutions that do have that are embedded and cited within the education system itself, and that have sort of sight of all of those complexities and those different levels. In my previous role at the organization I was with previously, which is called Citizen Leader Lab, we also worked across all five, but with a really clear focus on the lower 3. That was preferential, but we did occasionally work as well with quintile 4 and 5 schools. Currently, what I'm doing is really more at a meta level. So it's to think not about specific work into specific schools or into specific quintiles. It's really to see if it's possible to learn together, to facilitate together with multiple stakeholders who sit in very different spaces across the learning landscape, how we might think about the relationality of the work that we do, how we could possibly address some of the trust deficits that we have, and how we could start to think about how do we do this together with a systems insight. So not necessarily a systems work, because it's different. So there's lots of the entities that are participating in our kind of collaboration experiment run very specific programs, and they're very, very clear, and they're programmatic. So we're not asking for people to shift to a systems intervention. We're asking for lots of different actors and stakeholders and people who are invested and interested right across. So basically the invitation, anybody who is interested in human learning across the South African landscape, please join us so that we can really try and figure out together. Having said that, we don't have like 40,000 because it's huge. I mean, our landscape is huge. So we're kind of doing this experiment at a little bit of a fractal level. And it's complex. So, you know, can one experiment with this? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What might happen? How can we articulate it better? How can we experience it? How can we gain our own skills to maybe hold a way of being that facilitates that kind of approach in our individual spaces? And it's very experimental. So, you know, it doesn't have a linear or a defined, this is what we're going to do. It's kind of, we need to do something. How?
So this is what really interests me about your work, because the emphasis that I'm hearing you put an strong accent on, isn't on this is what we're going to do together. And I hear you before when we talked, and now you're emphasizing the relational field. So that's an unusual approach to collaboration, and I'm sure everybody would love to hear a little more detail in your approach to relationality, and also it seems how it seems to allow the complexity to it doesn't oversimplify the complexity of what you described.
Yeah, you know, so there's quite a strong, and I'm not going to pretend to be a systems scientist because I'm not a systems scientist, but I'm really, really interested in systems science, and I'm really, really interested in learning more about that, and in kind of taking the theory of that and seeing, okay, well, you know, how do we practice it? What does it feel like? What does it look like? And a lot of, you know, a lot of that thinking is quite contrary to current systemic how our systems work. So the linearity of them, the structure, the defined roles, the push towards outcomes, the push towards projects, and there's nothing wrong with that. So, you know, the balance between the kind of way we do things and the what we are doing is important. You don't lose that balance, but in between there somewhere sits something around intention and way of being. And it's really easy to fall off on either side of the scale when we are not intentional and focused on trying to return to but why and how. And so, you know, I guess I think I spoke with you about this analogy when we were chatting before. But there's this beautiful analogy around that really helps me to understand and explain and think about what we're trying to do in our, so the group we've started to try and experiment with this, we've called it Eco Connect. And it's about really seeing how do you create learning ecosystems, what does it take? But the analogy is this, it's sort of, if you're watching a basketball game or any kind of sport that you prefer, if you're watching a basketball game, how we watch them is we watch all the players, and we watch that, you know, we watch how they hit to each other, and we watch the star, you know, basketball player, and we thrilled when he can jump high and toss that ball in the hoop. And, you know, there's lots of sweaty, tall players rushing around and bashing into each other. And we think that's the game. It's not the game. The game is about how we open up or obstruct the pathway of the ball around that field. So the game is about what is the trajectory and the pathway of the ball, and how well can the players pay attention to the spaces between them to either open up or close down how the ball is flowing. And I guess that's a really beautiful analogy for saying, I think that collectively we've kind of so habituated to focusing on the players that we've lost a lot of skill around understanding the flow and understanding the in-between pieces and understanding what is the energy that's at work here and how is this energy either opening opportunities or shutting them down.
Right. So it's almost at the root of that description of the game, there's 2 or 3 simple distinctions almost that are fundamental to the game flowing that you're making there. So, and you talked about ways of being. So presumably you and your colleagues that are holding space for this are aware of it. How are you inviting or opening for people joining it to see that is the pathway of the ball, as it were?
So there's this, and I've completely, like, it's gone out my head who it was. It's not Nancy Klein, it's somebody else, but it's a beautiful phrase that kind of the interior condition of the convener determines the success of the intervention. I think it's Peter Block, actually. So so really, for us collectively, so it's one thing to individually sort of pay attention, mindfulness, all of the things that we kind of have become accustomed to doing at an individual level, becoming mindful, you know, reflecting on your own thinking, metacognition, all of these things. That's fantastic at an individual level. But when we're talking about a system, we need to start practicing that. We need to start understanding how to do that collectively. And so a lot of what we have been doing, and we use, I mean, it's a tricky thing because we have an hour every Friday morning that we've committed to. People come, people go. The invitation is porous. So the boundaries, literally the invitation is as wide in as if you have an interest in human learning in the country, you are welcome to join. You don't have to join. You don't feel obligated. But when you can and if you want, the space is consistently here. And so in that, although we have over time, so we've been running this for 2.5 years, covered quite a lot of different systems, thinking approaches, you know, kind of trauma management stuff, listening skills, attention skills, communication skills, a lot of different sort of methodologies or processes. The truth is that somebody may arrive quite new, and the hope is that kind of we are collectively embodying this to such a degree that landing in the space, there's a responsiveness to how you feel when a space is human. And that landing in the space becomes, as you mentioned in your first slide, a conversation that shifts direction. A space that builds our courage. A place that kind of leaves us feeling like we've entered into an oasis. Our thinking is clearer. We've elevated our intent. And when we go back out to do our specific work, that comes with us. And so it is difficult because you can't scale it, but you can diffuse it. And I think that's what the hope is. Yeah.
So this sounds a little bit to me akin to the kind of concept of having a social field.
Yeah.
Like there's a learning field, and I hear your job is to cultivate the field, not to control the activities of the players, as it were, but to make it possible for, I would say, more fully engaged people in the education system, more fully engaged teachers.
Absolutely, and it's not my job. So this is a collective. So, you know, it's our job. It's our job. And every single person that comes into the space has something like profoundly beautiful to bring and to add to that. And I think we support each other to then individually learn how to be more, because I don't even think there is something around skill set. Okay, undoubtedly there's something around skill set, but quite often the thing around skill set is not skill set, it's courage. Yeah. So I have an experience. I love that experience. I kind of feel there's value. I have another space where, you know, we have a specific way of doing things. Maybe I can experiment with a bit because it's quite vulnerable to experiment with this sort of stuff. And what might happen. And so, you know, that kind of, yes, skilling, but it's not really, you know, there are no fancy skills here. These are like fundamental human capacities that we've forgotten. We've forgotten how to listen properly. We've forgotten how to be together properly. And so there's a lot there around the evocation of just give it a bash.
And you mentioned diffusion. I think people that are listening that are less familiar with your work would be interested in hearing maybe what shifts have happened for others in their work because of engaging in this different way with in your relationship field, as it were, or in these sessions that you run.
It's difficult for me to speak on behalf of others. I mean, some of the participants, specifically in the Ed Eco group, are here, and I'm really hoping that they can rather speak to that themselves.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think that I think that what we are seeing. So when we went into this, the hope was, okay, so. And there was quite a lot of pushbacks. I mean, we had quite a lot of people in the initial group who, after a while, said, like, but what are we actually doing together? And when the feedback was, well, we'll see what emerges, but we're not focused on the doing of a something. We all have a ton that we are doing already. We don't need a new project, but maybe what we need is this community of care. And the hope is actually to think about how we pay attention to each other and how that might influence our capacity for shared and co-creative work and what could emerge. And so coming in, there's kind of a lead period. What we started seeing about 6 months in, and really increasingly from the first year in, these almost spontaneous connections that were happening. I cannot even tell you all of the things that have happened because we don't track them, because that's not the goal of what we're doing. But there is definitely kind of, it's much easier to do a piece of work without feeling like, our relationship, there's this seismic shift that happens at the midpoint around, we focus on our capacity to collaborate together for the sake of a job. And there's a very different thing that happens when we focus on our relationship, and any work that we do informs that and strengthens that.
Right.
It's subtle, but really different.
Yeah.
So I think, there are a couple of things. So there are a couple of a number of these sort of spontaneous people finding ways to work together, making new ways to work together, things that they hadn't envisaged before, but they kind of something sparked. Then I think there's been quite a bit of practice of some of the things that we do in our sessions together, going back into own organizations. The one last year, it wasn't you, Ansha, I can't remember who it was, but somebody saying that they were wanting to hold a strategy session, and we'd run a session on reflection. And instead of running a strategy session forward focused, she actually ran a reflective session, which had a hugely different influence.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that, Robyn. Obviously, I think there's probably a lot more that we could share if we went for longer, but I think I'm going to stop the recording, and then we'll have a pause and people can come back and discuss. Maybe I'm just going to stop the recording now.